Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this webinar on the events and possible outcome of the events in Belarus. As everybody knows, we had the elections in Belarus on the 9th of August this year, and these elections were followed by protests and followed by a wide variety of civil servants and police officers, military who resigned. Even journalists from the state media supported the protesters and quit their work. But as time passes, I have the impression that the protest is wearing a bit out, and it seems that the initial strength has been lost a bit. Still, ordinary citizens are still resisting and demonstrating all over the country, of course, mainly in Minsk. But it goes without any doubt that the crisis has reached some kind of a stalemate. First of all, Lukashenko resisted to step down. Secondly, Putin is hesitant and unwilling. Perhaps he is waiting for Lukashenko to provide him with some more time to implement a pro-Russian transitional administration. But thirdly, and most importantly, the citizens of Belarus, the Belarusians, they do not give up, and they keep on protesting in the streets on a daily basis. What will happen next, or what the future will bring, is not easy to predict. Lukashenko is getting more and more harsh. At the same time, he is becoming more and more dependent on Russia. While the international community itself is, let's say, a bit hesitant with pronouncing itself and expressed only its concern with the developments without taking effective action. So this webinar will try to shed lights on the latest developments in Belarus, including internal and external dynamics. And the speakers today will provide you with an explanation of the Russian intervention, comparing the actual situation in Belarus with what happened in Ukraine. Last but not least, the European perspective will help us to grasp the crisis in its entirety and its possible consequences. The experts who will take the floor are, first of all, Jakob Wallenstein. He is Director of Country Office Belarus at Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. And he will give us more insights into the latest developments in Belarus and the internal and external dynamics playing a role in the crisis. He will be succeeded by Mrs. Olena Snigir. She's a researcher at Beyond the Horizon, and she will provide some clarification of Russian intervention to Ukraine and Belarus, focusing on their similarities and differences. Thirdly, CEO and President of Beyond the Horizon, Hassan Susan, will talk about the Russian playbook in political warfare and the great power competition. And then, last but not least, Petras Ostravicius from the Renew Europe group will elaborate on the EU's position on the crisis in Belarus and European Parliament's related activities. So this being said, I will disappear and leave the floor to Jakob Wallenstein. Please, Jakob, the screen is all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you even more for the invitation for this very fine initiative. I think it's extremely important to keep Belarus on the agenda and to keep talking about this. As you rightly mentioned, Belarus seems to have vanished from the headlines in especially Western Europe. We came back to Germany with my family 2 days ago for the first time since Christmas 2019. And here everybody tells me, so what's happening in Belarus? We don't see it anymore. It was so present, and now we're not talking about this. Although Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, as you know, was in Berlin this week. She met the president and the president of the parliament. So there was high-ranking visits, but obviously the news agenda is dominated by the new lockdown that we have and all the other crises that are happening throughout the globe. So thank you for the initiative. I think what you said in the beginning, in the introductory remarks, that we see a stalemate pretty much describes the situation. I would say it's a frosty and it's a bloody stalemate, because it does not mean that the situation is calm. It is still the situation which we've seen throughout the last months, in that regard, that none of the two sides, neither the democracy movement and the population, who are I would still very convincingly say that the majority who want changes in the country, neither they can win, nor Lukashenko, who is supported mainly by the security forces, can win at this point in time. So this is a stalemate in the situation. People have understood that they will not have a very fast victory, but it's a long-term process. And this is something which is fundamentally different from situations we saw, for example, 10 years ago after the 2010 elections and the fraud and the violence, where people seemingly gave up very quickly after initial strong violence. Now people understand it's a very, very long-term protest and process, and that it will not be even over if there is a change of government. People don't believe in a fast victory, and this, I think, partly contributes to why we don't see these huge demonstrations on the Sundays, although obviously this is also because there's a huge violence being applied all the time. But the protest now is finding a lot of new ways, more decentralized, in smaller places. Last weekend, we saw over 120 local marches, sometimes just a few dozen people, sometimes up to a few hundred. So this means people are very much organizing, and this is more decentralized, not that Telegram channels announce where to meet. People tell me that sometimes it's even difficult to find those rallies because it's so decentralized. Corona is playing a strong role as well at the moment. You know that the government has been not very open, to say the least, about the Corona pandemic in the beginning, and still now they are struggling, to say the best, with the transparent communication. The numbers I saw say that every 5th Corona test that has been taken is positive. That, I think, is an indicator how huge the pandemic is also raging in Belarus. People say it's important to keep going and to have the protest, even if it's local and just rather symbolic, on those day-to-day activities, and doesn't hit the news threshold in Western Europe, because it's a mental petrol station to them to keep coming back to see that they're still there. And first of all, not to let Lukashenko win. If the protests are still continuing, and even if it's small and decentralized, it does not mean that he can claim that he has a situation under control. And all the time, there can be a new trigger, which will even bring back hundreds of thousands, which can be another fake election, which can be a new announcement of Lukashenko to have one turn or the other, or even national memory days. So what we see is a historic process. Many have described this as the formation of the Belarusian nation, the final breakthrough of the formation in a process of over 150 years. Abroad, the opposition is forming itself, or the democracy movement rather, in several centers. You know, Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya's team is working from Vilnius, the Coordination Council, and also Mr. Pavel Latushko and his initiative are working from Warsaw. They're active from there, but people keep going in Belarus. Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya has declared herself now to be willing to lead the country through the transition period. This is a new development. I think it was about 2 weeks ago. All the time before, she had been saying that she is a national leader of some kind. She did not declare herself the real president, but she says she's ready to lead the country through the transition period, but she does not want to run in a new free and fair election. She will not stand, as much as she says, but she wants to lead the country to this point, which was the mandate that she got in the election. That's what she was campaigning on. If you look at the agenda of the protests, of the democracy movement at the moment, this has taken a focus on the punishment of security officials who have been responsible, or are being responsible, for the violence. So they announced an initiative, a unified crimes registration book, to record all the crimes against humanity, among them torture and violence in the streets. And the 20th of December, so this upcoming Sunday, has been declared the day of the People's Tribunal. So they want to collect this, and the people of Belarus collect this for a future legal process against all these perpetrators. Lukashenko at the moment is trying to play normality. He has been trying to play this since the election day. He's visiting hospitals now, so this is a change in rhetoric. And he pretends to be leading this dialogue, which everybody knows is not a real dialogue, but he's having selected people with the dialogue. And he is still working on this agenda to have a constitutional reform. That's what he says. And his latest suggestion was to have the All Belarusian People's Congress. So this is a gremium which meets once in 5 years, 2,500 delegates, and doesn't have a constitutional role right now. To have this gremium, this institution, turned into a high-ranking constitutional entity. So to shift this, to shift the power away from the president's office to this new super entity, and possibly to declare himself the head of this new entity, that would be a way for him to stay in power. I think it could be described as the Kazakhstan scenario in some way. So finding a way around to stay in power. Still, the violence, as I said, is huge and it's still happening. We have a bloody stalemate. We have seen over 30,000 arrests. At the moment, I think it's 155 political prisoners. 4,000 complaints have been carried to the prosecutor's offices. Not a single case has been opened against the violence, so against policemen or the election fraud. We see that some on the authority side, some taboos have been dropped, which we were observing earlier, so that pensioners would not be attacked, women would be spared from prosecution or from violence, and even minors. All this is now still happening. And the latest move you probably saw was that Lukashenko announced to close the borders of Belarus on the 21st of December, that people would not be able, or would be difficult to leave only through the airport. People could get out of the country. The government has been running a rally of punishing those who were opposing against them, sometimes shutting off electricity, shutting off warm water to some districts of Minsk, and shutting down businesses, prosecuting people who joined in the strike, also going into families. They're now thinking of having a foreign agent law like the Russian Federation does. A few points on the international dimension. You know that the European Union yesterday bestowed the Sakharov Prize on the Belarusian opposition movement broadly, naming a few people, but not just for Tikhanovskaya, but namely several people. So the third time Sakharov Prize goes to Belarus. But at the same time, the third package of sanctions has been agreed. And today we will see the list of the 29 people who are now added to this sanctions list, and 7 organizations, which is a new dimension. Still, the Belarusian opposition is thankful for this. They demand more and faster actions, even more sanctions to be taken, more support. You know that the so-called Marshall Plan is under dialogue in the European Union, an economic support package for a future democratic Belarus. This message, I think, is very strong. But it's important to keep in mind Belarusian people want to solve this crisis themselves. It is an internal issue of Belarus, and they want to have help, of course, and look for the European Union and the international community, not the West, but the international community, for support for their just causes of rule of law and human rights. But they say they want and they will solve this themselves. There's a huge confidence in this. The European Union, I'm sure Mr. Auštrevičius will mention this in more detail. There's a fact-finding mission that will be created, a new friendship group of the European Parliament. But a mission that was supposed to go to Belarus now to talk about the Astravets nuclear plant, I think a topic which Mr. Auštrevičius might also touch upon because it's very strong in the Lithuanian Belarusian perspectives. That group could not go. That was supposed to be a mission to Belarus to see about the safety of Astravets, and that did not materialize at the moment. The Russian Federation has been continuing their dialogue with communication with representatives of Minsk. You know that the foreign minister was in Belarus lately, and from what can be seen outside from these talks is that Russia is not very confident, not very content on how things are going. They are looking for faster progress. From what we know is that from the talks in Sochi in September, Putin and Lukashenko agreed, or Putin wanted Lukashenko to find a way for him to step down, to have a transition through the constitutional reform, but it seems they're not happy on how this is progressing. And Russia is raising the pressure for a solution which is constitutional. There has not been an agreement on the oil and gas supplies from Russia to Belarus yet. This is always a delicate issue. And on the other hand, Putin still supports Lukashenko's narrative. Right now, Putin right now is giving a huge annual speech to journalists for several hours, and he already said that he supports this narrative of international or foreign intervention, namely from the West, that is steering the opposition in Belarus. But at the same time, he keeps saying, and recently said this at a summit, that the Belarusian people shall resolve the crisis themselves. Just to quote him, Belarusian people will have enough political maturity to calmly, without any sudden movements, build an internal political dialogue with all political forces and resolve all their internal issues independently. So these are Putin's words. They want to see an internal solution in the constitutional way. Just one last thing, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, you know, she has been meeting with a lot of Western and international leaders. She now said that she would be ready to meet Putin. But from what I know, there has not been any reaction from the Russian side. And I think it's very unlikely that Putin will meet with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. Let me stop here for an introduction over the last developments.
Thank you very much, Jakob. During your expose, I had the idea, or the question rather, on how long do you think that the resistance can endure without fading away completely, without an actual revolution or an intervention from Europe, or whether from Russia? Something must happen to unlock things, if I may say, call it that way.
So people keep telling us that they are very resolved to continue and to carry on. I think this is through to several reasons. The country is different from the country it was before these elections, and it's fundamentally different from the country we saw 10 years ago. There has been a structural change of values. There has been a change of the economic configuration of the country. So people have a lot to lose. And I think everybody knows that even if the protests faded now, the country would not return to the place where it was in the early spring this year, or even last year, because if Lukashenko was really to succeed in crushing the protests, we would see a huge wave of counter-revolution, so destroying those freedoms that were created and were given. We see now, as I said, there's a huge wave of punishment, which is going against those who dare to speak up. And this liberal economic climate, I think that will be crushed as well, because people, they see that those who took to the streets are mostly coming from those who have an independent economic background. Not exclusively, but this is obviously a strong force in this. So I don't think people will give in at any point. They will continue and carry on. But the question is, unlocking this from the outside, I think would be extremely difficult and dangerous, and not in the interest of the people themselves. They are hoping still for the authorities to engage in dialogue with them to find a way out of the crisis. And as I said, I think any trigger could come and respark the protests. We've been seeing discontent also among the elites. There's not been a huge wave of defection, but still policemen, for example, have been resigning. I recently saw the number that apparently the central police unit of Minsk Centralne, has 30% of open places for policemen. So many police people left the service. So people are still, I think, hoping and carry on the struggle.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's obvious that this will trigger a lot of questions, but before losing ourselves in questions at this point, I would like to give the floor to Olena Snigir. As already mentioned, she will provide some clarification on the Russian intervention to Ukraine and Belarus, and making the comparison between both of the countries. Olena, you have the floor. You have to unmute.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to this webinar. It is very important and very hot topic. So I would try to be short to leave the floor for questions and for some small discussion. So differences and similarities in Russian tactics towards Ukraine and Belarus, and Russian toolkit towards Ukraine and Belarus. It's quite interesting was also for me to think about it, because though Belarus and Ukraine are very, from some point of view, they're very similar country, but still today we see that Russian toolkits of Russian policy toward Ukraine and Belarus are differ very much. So Belarus and Ukraine both were viewed and still are viewed by the Kremlin as indispensable parts of its integrational ambitions in the closest neighborhood. Today, Ukraine and Belarus stand on polar positions in their relations with Russia. Russian policy towards these countries also is different. Today, toward Ukraine, Moscow uses all instruments of politics, from soft power to conventional warfare. Towards Belarus, Russia declares non-intervention policy, while at the same time Moscow fully controls informational sphere of Belarus and has critical influence on the economy, defense and military sphere, and thus literally controls internal and foreign policy of Belarus. The goal of Moscow on Ukrainian and Belarusian directions is the same: to have these countries in the sphere of control. And it is not about a partnership, alliance, or cooperation. It is so-called neo-colonization project with the extraction of resources and the destruction of identity. Let me remind you the end of existence of Soviet Union had been fixed by Belarus-The Accords in 1991, which at the same time established the Commonwealth of Independent States in its place as successor entity. And later, the Ukrainian parliament ratified these accords with amendments which made impossible the creation of a new Soviet Union on the basis of these accords. Therefore, the Russian Federation then had chosen another scenario for integration of the former Soviet Union space, at least some countries. That integration strategy had been designed in 3 dimensions: military and defense, economy, and in humanitarian dimension. In military and defense, it was designed like in the form of CSTO. In economy, it was designed in the form of Eurasian Economic Commonwealth from 2001 to 2014, and today in the form of Eurasian Economic Union from 2015. And humanitarian dimension, it is the concept of Ruski Mir, or Russian world, which is very familiar for everyone, I think. So Russian Federation from early 90s used the same leverages and instruments of influence in relations with Minsk and Kiev. In economy, it was dependence on energy resources and Russian money. Soft power, it was Russian language, propaganda, disinformation, etc. And in political leverage was corrupting of political elites in Ukraine and Belarus. And also there was very important the case of military presence on Ukrainian and Belarusian territory. Russia has possessed monopoly in energy supply to Ukraine till 2015, not anymore, but still it is the monopolist in energy supply for Belarus, and Gazprom fully controls the gas transportation system of Belarus. And also Russia is the biggest trading partner of Belarus and the biggest investor in Belarus economy. And more than half of foreign debt of Belarus is due to Russia today. In the sphere of humanitarian dimension, propaganda, narratives of 3 brotherhood nations, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians, which create one people with common historical destiny, the leadership and civilizing mission of the Russian Empire in the history of Ukraine and Belarus, and the artificial nature of Ukrainian and Belarusian language, etc. It's about the destruction of identity. And the recent decision of Alexander Lukashenko to invite Russian management and Russian journalists to the main state media of Belarus shows that official Belarusian policy in informational sphere is under full Russian control. Military alliance. Basically, Belarus and Russia coordinate their military activity, air defense system, and under United Center of Command. Russia has access to control of Belarus border, and Russian special forces can freely operate on the territory of Belarus. So first, today we see that Russia actually possesses the full control of Belarusian policy. What first and most important that made it all possible is the dictatorship of Alexander Lukashenko, the undemocratic and repressive political system of Belarus from the time of referendum in 1906, when he opened the door for Russian influence. The policy of repressions didn't give a chance for civil society development and growth of alternative political leaders and forces. Propaganda and disinformation and absence of independent mass media kept Belarusians in informational bubble of successful, alternative, peaceful way for a sovereign post-Soviet country with strong and fair partnership with Russian Federation. And here is the main difference between protests in Ukraine, which took place in 2004 and 2013, and protests in Belarus. While Ukrainians demanded change of system of political decision-making, reforms, and showed clear awareness of Russian interference, protests in Belarus demand do not go further changing of the president through fair elections. That's also a lot, but not enough. Russian policy toolkit for Ukraine and Belarus today is different, adopted for different conditions, but still aimed at the same goal, to keep these countries in its sphere of influence. Today, the main Russian task for policy in Belarus is to keep steady political course of this country towards integration with Russian Federation. And we see that Moscow hurries up. And this can be done peacefully only if Belarusians save their loyalty to Russia. So it is critically important for Moscow to secure a good attitude of the people of Belarus to Russian Federation. Though Moscow could support any of the candidates to presidential position in Belarus, it has chosen Lukashenko due to a few reasons. He is toxic. He is isolated politically, and Moscow is one of few capitals where he is accepted. Second, if any other candidate becomes a president, he or she will have support from the West, and thus more possibilities in relations with Russia and more choice. And the third, Belarusian protest is a very good case study for Russian repressive system. Moscow perceives all protests as a dangerous example for the Russian people, which because Russian protest activity and potential is much lower than Belarusians today. So it is critically important for Moscow to have this protest suppressed and protest activity vanished. And it has been done by the hands of Alexander Lukashenko. Russian policy toward Ukraine contains a combination of all leverages today, from soft power to conventional warfare instruments, because Ukrainian society is more resistant and more aware of Russian instruments and Russian goals. That's probably, I will stop for now and wait for questions.
Yes, thank you, Olena. There is a question in the chat room, but I suggest that we will keep it until the end of the exposés. Otherwise, we will be losing ourselves in detailing. But thank you. This was a very clear statement. In fact, if I may resume your exposé. There is some intervention from Russia, but it's not there for everyone to see, if I understand you correctly.
Yeah, should I clarify it now?
Yes, please.
It's question. Yeah, okay. To my mind, and to, well, as many experts, at least in Ukraine, assume, Russia totally controls Belarus, at least foreign policy, absolutely, and internal policy mostly, because Belarus is dependent on Russia in economic sphere, and it has no, well, it had some chance with China till probably this protest, but still China is not, partnership with China doesn't give much room for political decision in foreign policy. Yeah. Then politically, military cooperation and cooperation in defense. Basically, we do not know how much Belarus military forces integrated with Russian, because this is very closed sphere. But from what we see here from Ukraine, that Russian special forces have very much freedom in their actions, in their activity on Belarus territory. That our people, Ukrainians, do not feel safe when they come to Belarus. And we have been witnessed, everybody of us have been witness of what was going on during the drills, Zapad 2018 and 2019 and 2017 every year. So we see how they coordinate, how they cooperate. And the last probably bastion that Lukashenko kept for his sake there was his decision not to give Russia possibility to have its permanent air base on the territory of Belarus, near Bobruisk. So that is what Russia really wants, and that was that Putin pushes in every meeting with Lukashenko. And I think that we have to be ready to the creation of this air base in the shortest future.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you. Next in line is Mr. Susan. He will talk about the Russian playbook in political warfare and the great power competition. Mr. Susan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First, let me share my screen. You see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. Okay, today I'm going to talk about modern Russian playbook and its footprint in the great power competition especially. I want to begin with a quick overview. To understand deeply the modern Russian playbook, I have examined Russian actions and counteractions since 2007 and made a cross-case analysis using computational techniques. So I will mention three main points to give an overview. First, as you see, Russia demonized nation building elsewhere in the former Russian Empire. The ongoing Russian occupation of the whole region also reflects the Russian grand strategy to back up its great power region with its new way of warfare. Secondly, Russian present strategy is geared toward preventing the Western expansion. Therefore, Russia wants to keep the post-Soviet states politically weak, economically dependent to Russia, and their borders unsettled. Furthermore, I would highlight Russian malign economic and political influence in Europe as a main enabler. Finally, recent experiences strongly suggest that the period of soft balancing ended, and the year 2007 marked the beginning of hybrid and hard balancing. On this background, we can start with a general view of Russian way of warfare. The character and the fundamental rules of war have changed for sure. But what we are witnessing today is a new way of warfare, employing mostly disruptive technologies, especially in the great power competition. In this frame, Russian way of war has 6 specific dimensions, as seen on the slide. But to obtain a deep insight, understanding, first we need to recognize specific actions and also counteractions in each dimension, as well as interconnectivity and the patterns. But how? Let's move to a general concept of computational approach that I used. I do not want to go into details. Overall, there are 4 stages in the process, starting from data ingestion and ending with simulations. In line with this concept, in the event recognition phase, after a targeted data collection, we have recognized specific Russian actions and counteractions, as seen on the slide. Then we have classified them into 4 different groups and clustered around 2 phases. Then for classifying and clustering the recognized events, I use multi-layer models. The first layer is modern warfare event classification model, which divides events into 4 quadrants. The horizontal axis covers Russian events from covert to overt, and vertical axis displays the spectrum from indirect to direct. For instance, the left upper quadrant, namely direct covert, contains cyber espionage, disinformation campaigns, legal government operations, and the like. After that, As a second layer for classification, I use conflict intensity spectrum. Events executed by Russia are categorized in 5 levels of intensity, from dispute to war. Alongside, all Russian events are clustered in 2 phases, namely shaping and intervention phases. As you see, the nexus of the 2 phases is violent crisis. I will touch upon later. With the combination of these 2 layers, we are able to map the Russian playbook. This is one of the initial outcomes of the study. The slide is visible, but I will try to explain in a simple way. Each axis has 2 layers. The Russian action and counter-actions are distributed along each axis with conflict intensity spectrum and warfare event classification spectrum. Events are labeled with numbers respectively, but all events are independent and not consecutive. However, close proximity accounts for interconnectivity and strong relations with the events which are close by. In other words, distribution of Russian recognized events along the axis show patterns, and it provides insight about the probability of the occurrence of the next events. During the shaping phase, Russia mostly uses non-military, non-kinetic tools. It's very logic. But if deterrence is failed or Russia intentionally wants to escalate the crisis, a transition from the shaping to intervention phase will take place. For instance, number 17, large-scale military exercises, or number 29, support ethnic uprising. But the key characteristic of the intervention phase is operating below the legal threshold of war. For instance, number 14 is state-sponsored cyber attack. Number 36 is Little Green Man operation, etc. Lastly, I would like to mention the nexus, as I stated before. As you see, the nexus of the shaping and intervention phases is also clearly visible in this chart. Now, I would like to end with a summary of key takeaways. There are 6 things to consider. The first distinct feature is exploiting the legal gap and geopolitical inertia. Russia starts with an one-sided move. It then creates facts on the ground, primarily with a rapid and substantial military deployment, swiftly solidified with the creation of permanent structures, institutions, etc. It then waits for sanction from EU, from the UN, then prepares to weather the political storm, and it bets on the absence of military retaliation. Secondly, I would like to highlight that as the line between war and peace is blurred, digitalized political warfare, for me, which is the principal instrument of great power politics or competition, especially employing disruptive technologies such as autonomous sophisticated cyber attacks, AI-powered deepfakes, election interference, etc., becomes more visible in the current Russian case. Thirdly, the gray zone tactics, which are a covered subset of great power competition and short of conventional war, especially in the post-Soviet region, requires a special attention. Ambiguity and deniability are the main defining characteristic of Russian gray zone tactics. Accordingly, the nexus of Russian shaping and intervention phases is violent crisis, as I stated before. As seen in all cases, it is too late for the third parties to respond or mitigate or counter if the crisis or conflict passes this critical stage. Therefore, the threshold for the rule-based international order is violent crisis. Otherwise, the ultimate winner highly likely will be Russia. Fifthly, in the long run, Russian outdated imperialism will alienate the country's natural allies and will continue to be counterproductive, especially among the new generations in the post-Soviet region. Lastly, Russian playbook can be easily translated in other capitals, and as well as by malign non-state actors as a new way of warfare against the West. I think that concludes my presentation today. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Hasan. Thank you very much. And then, last but not least, Mr. Petras Ostrevicius. I hope I pronounced it correctly. He will inform us on the EU position on the crisis and the European Parliament's related activities. Petras, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting to approach you on such an important and I would say interesting issue as Belarus' present situation is about, and to make some comments on possible developments in a close future. I think we heard very correct and very interesting, even inspiring descriptions of present situation and what comes to the Russian intervention, hybrid intervention into the Belarus domestic and other policies from previous speakers, indeed. What comes to the EU position, I have probably to disappoint you. I mean, there are different EU positions. There is Parliament's position, which is probably more dynamic, and there are positions which might be presented by the European Commission or external service, which are more based on present situation. In general, I have to admit that I appreciate very much that Belarus is finally back on political map of Europe. It was neglected. It was overwhelmed by some very technical, very sectorial, sometimes very insignificant events. If I to recall, for example, my meetings in Belarus delegation, I was a member of this delegation in previous legislature. I have to admit, we've been dealing with education policy, high education system in Belarus, so-called Bologna process, which after all looked like, as a fake news, because there is no Bologna process in Belarus. I mean, let's stop making laughing stocks out of this. But the delegation leader was so dedicated, I mean, to those discussions, and was avoiding at any cost really political debates about the present situation in Belarus and a possible political outcome out of this. EU made many mistakes, sorry to say. I never supported retreat from the sanctions policy in 2016. It was one of the fatal mistakes made by the European Union based on some promises from Lukashenko, who never delivered, who always been on his line. I mean, we might be even, looking at him as a kind of leader. Sometimes you have to follow in sense of pursuing the policy line. So the EU was zigzagging in its policy towards Belarus, and here we came. I mean, beginning of 2020 for me promised some changes. I looked with great expectations to 2020 because I felt certain structural changes in the mindset of the nation, of some political, different political activism, different new forms of social activism. Especially social media was very creatively employed. Outreach, finally, the opposition figures, I mean, activists started, I mean, to go outside Minsk, and it in fact showed excellent results. I mean, take for example Sergei Tikhanovsky activities in this regard. But I mean, with the bringing back Belarus on the political map of Europe, it helps only partially, because there is a very tense situation now in Belarus. Indeed, there are two opposing forces. One, I believe it's much stronger, it's opposition, which has a huge potential, never used before in such a way. I think we saw awakening of a nation, absolutely new political entity, proud of its history. Finally, white, red, and white colors went on the streets. I mean, people read probably books and articles on Wikipedia about Belarus history, and they are not fed with only, you know, Lukashenko-style stories about birth of nation from 1941. So, which is a trash as such. And indeed, yesterday's event in the European Parliament, once presenting Sakharov Prize, Andrei Sakharov Prize to democratic opposition in Belarus, it's a very significant event. I think it's such a powerful motivation for those politicians who came to the European Parliament. By the way, 3 of them are still imprisoned, and it's a huge shame on the side of Lukashenko regime, generally speaking. And I'm looking forward, I mean, for continuous cooperation with opposition figures and activists in Belarus. Again, we have to face a reality. So that's why the European Union continuously is calling for a national dialogue, which should lead to new elections, new free and fair elections organized under different rules in Belarus. And this transitional period on which Svetlana Tikhanovskaya made a very promising statement to my mind. I mean, she takes more responsibility, and it shows that, I mean, she is growing as a politician. I mean, she's expanding in political understanding on the situation. So, I mean, when it will happen, never knows. And, you know, it's like a process. We have to be involved. We can't, I mean, the European Union can't be just a promise maker and outside observer of events. We have to be serious. If we make promises, we have to deliver. So that's why this formula of 3S for me is important: solidarity, support, and sanctions. All of them, they have to be implemented to full extent. And for the time of being, EU sanctions line against Lukashenko, it's still very, very light, if any. He was included in the second wave himself, the third wave with up to 30 more names and 7 entities. Sorry to say, it's not serious. It's not serious, knowing and taking into account the violence scale against civic society and individuals in Minsk. But hopefully, EU will get serious at one point and will make necessary decisions. And finally, connecting probably some dots in this regard. I mean, the Russian influence is huge, prevailing, and in fact, even now we see a hybrid intervention, well described by previous speakers. And this infiltrated state by the Russian apparatus, which is well financed and very effective in most cases, you know, it can't skip from our attention. And it was rightly mentioned by some analysts. If EU wants to have an effective impact on Lukashenko, probably we should consider certain actions against the Russian institutions and Russian entities which penetrated Belarus political defense, security apparatus, media, state media run apparatus, and make a clear signal to all of them. Otherwise, we will be fighting, you know, with the secondary causes after all. And to my mind, you know, the present situation in Belarus is one of the biggest nightmares to Putin. I think he written off Lukashenko as a leader. He never liked him in person. But for Putin, it's not the same which way Lukashenko will leave and what kind of the, let's say, initiative rights will be left for the society. Because, I mean, those two nations are close. They've been very much integrated during the 3 last decades. It's almost a union state. I mean, not yet constitutionally, but by de facto in most instances, yes. So that's why, I mean, it has a kind of a huge effect on the Russian society, generally speaking. So that's why we have to see events in Belarus in a much larger geopolitical, on larger geopolitical scale, which nobody knows. I mean, it might lead to some very strategic changes in a huge region. And there we come with the Eastern Partnership policy, by the way, which must be ready at the point Z or X. When things happen, we have to come up with the instrumentarium, set of tools, even a financial package, which might lead to effective transformation of those nations. Thank you.
Pedros, thank you very much. Your expose has triggered a lot of questions personally. One of them would be, having made the experience with Ukraine, what do you think can be used as additional power, if I can use that word, against Russia that has not been used yet already regarding the Ukraine crisis? What additional means do the European Union have?
Well, there might be a very kind of quick, resolution, one-off. For example, you might offer, without unnecessary delay, visa-free regime to Belarusians, not to nomenclatura people who are on Lukashenko's side. And here we should make probably the right list of those officials. But to ordinary people, why should we bother ourselves? I mean, we reduced already, the visa price for Belarusians starting from midst of summer this year. And it was completely right and even timely somehow decision. But why not to make a visa-free, to Belarusians?
Yeah.
That would be a kind of good message, to civic society from EU. We are open-minded and we're looking forward with your cooperation. And as I said, probably high EU officials should send kind of preventive measures to the Russian leadership. We're not going to send NATO tanks to Belarus. It's not our policy line. We never thought about this, but as rightly said by many, now Russian special forces are free to exercise on the Belarusian soil. Don't cross the red line. It will be not accepted. It's a sovereign state, and by all our, by the way, feelings, we have to support sovereign, democratic European Belarus. We're not to get them or give them any let's say obligatory membership yet. First reforms should go in Belarus, and we are if we come with a good proposal for sustained reforms package for Belarus, as we did in Ukraine, I'm sorry to say that we don't hear too many news from Ukraine now on reforms. But yeah, if you look deep into Ukraine's domestic policies, there are so many changes, by the way, and positive changes. We have to be proud of our impact and cooperation with Ukraine. So that's why having this kind of reforms coordination group, as it was established in Ukraine, led by former member Peter Wagner, who did an excellent job in this regard. So probably we have to think about something like this. Forming a team, well-informed, supported by investment banks, World Bank, and so on and so forth, a kind of task force which would recommend a good set of social economic reforms, so needed in Belarus, because economy has failed. Lukashenko's social economic policy is zero value.
Yeah. Peter, I will remain with you because there is a question coming from the attendees. That is right, your cup of tea. Mr. or Mrs. Merrick asks the following. In Belarus and some countries, we often witness the use of democracy as a tool by autocratic leaders himself or a small group in recent years. As in the US and many other countries, this populist response can be found. Should we be worried about the future of democracy? If not, what more concrete can be done in the context of international organizations to protect democracy from malicious leaders?
Right.
It's a tough question because this covers, let's say, the whole world, going from the US to Viktor Orban and so forth. This is a widespread problem, I think. Populist leadership, Bolsonaro in Brazil.
Yes, and there are different types, by the way, of populist leaders. I mean, Orban on one hand and Lukashenko on another one. I mean, they speak, very kind of simple, inviting language to ordinary people. And Lukashenko was, by the way, a great master, and he's a great master of this kind, organizing even government meetings in cow farms or on the fields and so on and so forth, with a kind of macho politician identity. But on one thing, probably we have to be clear. It took so much of time for EU to come with so-called European Magnitsky Act, which probably had to be adopted many years ago. But it's sooner later than never, all right? I mean, now we have it. And probably we have to be not hesitating in our capitals to apply this kind of set of restrictive measures against so-called popular leaders who are, as a rule, very corrupt persons. Unfortunately.
Well, it's not only that they are corrupt, but they are also appealing to sentiment and not to ratio. So that is a very dangerous problem, of course. We in Belgium, for instance, we can relate to what we call the cordon sanitaire. It is, let's say, shutting out a non-democratic party from participating into the power. So these are, let's say, means of taking care of things.
Indeed, I mean, cordon sanitaire is one of the measures we can employ. But look, do you remember a famous visit of I think it was the last visit of Mr. Lukashenko to the European Union. It was to Austria. Yeah. And I think Austrians made a huge mistake, I mean, inviting and accepting Lukashenko, because he lectured them, and he said in a final press conference with the president of federal state of Austria, like something like, okay, I mean, don't teach us, I mean, on democracy. I mean, we are more mature democracy than you are. And I think it's such a blast. I mean, it's such a mistake, I mean, to invite those populistic dictators, I mean, to the European, on the territory of the European Union, and let them lecture us on those things. Because, I mean, let's be frank, I mean, there are populists, there are some, radicals on our side, political left and right, I mean, who are eager consumers of those ideas. I mean, and they pick up and start spreading those news. So that's why, I mean, cordon sanitaire is something on which we have to be indeed more effective to employ.
Okay, thank you, Pedras. Now I would like to shift to Hassan. There is an anonymous attendee who asks the following question. Hi, thank you for this fascinating discussion. Is the model that Mr. Susan elaborated unique to Russia, or can it be transposed to other adversaries? Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, the model, the biggest advantage of this model is reusability. So I didn't go into details about the methodology, but there are specific pillars of the state of the art of the methodology. One is dynamic ontology. So if in a case, if we have actors, I mean state, non-state, terrorist organizations, or key leaders, it doesn't matter. If we have actors, if we have occurrences, incidents, events, if we have time and location, it's enough. So we can run our dynamic ontology, and then we can define interconnectivity and a pattern. We can make pattern analysis, and then we can predict the next step, and also we can simulate the multiple feature scenarios. But by the way, let me mention one thing. We do not, or I do not see Russia as an adversary or enemy. So we do believe that the West should also look for common ground in potential cooperation areas with Russia. And Russia still can be a part of a broader security architecture for the Europe. But there is a reality. So there is a Russian aggression. So there is a Russian grand strategy. It's really a threat to our rule-based international order. That's why we need to understand well, deeply, and then we need to respond smartly. That's why we try to understand and work or develop a novel methodology to develop smart and sustainable response.
Yes, I fully agree, Hassan, but still, you say let's not consider Russia as the enemy or as the adversary. I fully agree. But how can you detach this view from what has happened in Ukraine, where there was, let's say, some flu, if I may call it that way? And how can you detach with the latest evolutions, for instance, in the Hague, where 2 diplomats have been declared persona non grata because infringements on cybersecurity. So there is whether you like it or not, there is still this kind of adversary, or it's anyway the Russians are the others. Let's call it that way.
So totally agree with you. Just I want to express that we still need to open the doors for Russia,
of course,
to involve in the broader security architecture for the Europe. Yeah. But in the cases that you mentioned, so Russia acts as an enemy, so for sure.
No, I do not consider them as enemies myself, but of course, it is a much broader problem than just the problem with Belarus. There are some precedents, but okay. Then I have a last question, and I think this is one that should be answered by Jakob. This is a question coming from Jonathan Millens of the University of Antwerp, asking what role, if any, could the US government-funded Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, play during the next stage of the crisis in balancing against the dominance of Russian media in Belarus?
And I think the role that free media can play is already being played by them to a huge extent. That they deliver unbiased information. I think what free media have to keep in mind is not to build the counter propaganda. And I think from everything that I see, they're doing a good job at this. So being transparent about that in an environment which we see in Belarus, where it is ever more difficult to obtain information from the ground, where journalists are being jailed, where media outlets are shut down, like very recently Tudbay was deprived of its mass media status. And the government or the authorities are making it particularly hard to obtain information that, of course, also serious media and independent media can make mistakes. I think this is something which is important to bear in mind, not to claim that everything that free media present is is free from mistake, I think, and therefore, yeah, contributing to a mature understanding of media work. So not creating counter propaganda, but being genuine, also about weaknesses, about, well, but it's part of the human nature, that not everything is black or white. But of course they should, yeah, pay attention and be careful not to be utilized or instrumentalized by either side, but to be as genuine on fact checking as is part of ethics of good journalism.
Okay, thank you for this answer. So, gentlemen, and Olena, I think that we have reached the end of this webinar. I have no other questions popping up on my screen.
May I add a few words?
Yes, but by all means, Olena.
Okay. I would like to answer. There was also a question, and there was answer about what kind of measures could be added to stop Russian intentions towards Belarus, according to what it did in Ukraine. So I would say that if the West, and it's obviously dangerous to use conventional weapons, to use conventional methods to stop the Russian aggression or possible Russian aggression, if the West cannot do it, so there are alternative measures which must be, if they to be effective, they must be as painful as Russian aggression is. And I am talking about economic measures. So fast way, and it was spoken out already when Russian aggression to Ukraine began in 2014. The fast way is to cut Russian energy supplies to Europe. Stop buying Russian energy resources. Stop paying them. Stop giving them money. Okay, but if I assume that it is very fast, but very critical and very uncomfortable way. So it's unreal, maybe. But there is another way also to stop, to make impossible for Russian political elite to use Western benefits. I mean, to buy houses and some other stuff in the West, to take some medical cure in the Western countries, to spend their time in the Western countries, to buy property, to send their children to study to the Western universities, because Russian political elite uses its people as the resource of money and the resource of its prosperity, and it spends its money and prosperity and uses its prosperity to buy a good life, a better life in the West, on the Western lands. So if you cut this possibility for them, maybe it would be as painful as stopping buying energy resources. So, and policy of sanctions must be more systematic in this way. It must be full-fledged, and it must prevent any loopholes for those big companies who want to make business as usual with Russia as it was before. So that's probably what I wanted to add.
Yeah, perhaps Petras, a reply on this?
I can only applaud. I mean, this very correct and very, substantial proposal. And I was very critical about, although appreciating, but at the same time critical about this European Magnitsky Act, which didn't include corruption as a crime. On what Putin's elites entourage thrills, that's corruption. I mean, they steal money from Russian people and for personal enrichment. Their children are in the best high schools of Europe. They have villas in very prestigious, warm places in Europe. And we are silent. But I always tell my friends in the European Parliament, the day will come and the democratic Russia will bang on the door of some European countries asking, give our money back. And I mean, don't make a mistake. I mean, receiving and accepting those corrupted officials now in order to avoid big problems in future. Because I am a strong believer in democratic Russia. One day or another, it will come up. You will see. It's unavoidable. I mean, it might take time. So that's why don't make mistakes. So that's why I can only applaud them in this remark completely.
Yes. Thank you, Petrus, for this reply. So I think this time we really come to the end of the webinar. I have no questions any longer, except if one of the panelists would like to comment on what has been said before. No? So,
thank you for bringing us together.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us and with the attendees, and I hope we will meet and speak each other soon in better times.
Merry Christmas.
Be safe.
Merry Christmas to you all.
Okay.
Happy New Year.
Goodbye. Thank you.